Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm doing a bit of a weekly wrap up and I, advance warning, I've had a week off and therefore have done a lot of reading. And I know that I tend to read a fair amount anyhow, but I don't think I was really prepared for sort of how much I was going to try and attempt to read with having a full week off with no real plans. So I have largely just been sat in bed next to my cat, just reading, which honestly has been bliss. Highly recommend it. But it's been a really fun week of reading for me. I've had some books that I've been wanting to get around to for a while, some brand new releases, some books for prizes, all the usual fare. So let's get stuck into talking a bit about those. First up, I read Acting Class by Nick Drnaso, and as you'll notice by the fact that this book is bigger than my head, this is a giant graphic novel, and Nick Drnaso was previously longlisted for the Booker, and with Sabrina, which I absolutely adore, and this book I also loved in a very, very similar way. So essentially the core idea behind Acting Class is that we've got, I think, 7 or so people who all basically come to join this free acting class that's being run sort of locally to them, and some of the people already know each other, and so sort of go along with each other. Some of them meet at the acting class, but all of them go through these really sort of strange little journeys with it. And actually, as it goes on, we find out increasingly that this acting class is not exactly what it seems, but also has other unexpected results. So, for example, there is a character who's sort of dissociating every so often, and this class is sort of potentially seen as a way that she can tap into some of her feelings. We have somebody else who is an ex-prisoner who is sort of trying to get his life back in order and trying to regain some confidence about who he is, and sort of the acting class is part of that. We have another character who is trying to understand his role, but it seems to be sort of racked by guilt, so he constantly thinks that he's going to get persecuted for something, and so it's just this really interesting group of people who all go on these very, very strange journeys. And I think what I loved about this and Sabrina by him as well is it's incredibly evocative. Like the images are quite simple, the drawing style is quite simple, but so much comes up from it. He uses the sense of space really well, I think. So often there'll be a page that doesn't have much text on it, and is mostly pictures, and even those pictures are quite empty, but actually it works because we as the reader almost need that pause to understand the sort of stillness of these characters. It's incredible. I loved it. I basically started reading it last night thinking I was just going to read a few pages before bed, and I ended up staying up late, sort of spending just 2 hours solidly just reading this and just being immersed in its world. I loved it. I think it's incredible. Yeah. And thank goodness my library had it, because I love this so much. Another 5-star read for me this week, and there are a few, is What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat by Aubrey Gordon. And so if anybody knows the podcast Maintenance Phase, Aubrey Gordon is one of the hosts of that. And this book is a set of sort of mini essays, or sort of personal mini essays that build sort of towards a bit of a conclusion of actually what sort of fat phobia looks like in a broader sense, and what her own experiences have been like of being someone in a larger body moving through the world. And there's a lot in this that I think sort of challenge some of my own preconceptions, I guess, around quite a lot of this. So as with the podcast, a lot of what she focuses on is how there is a wider conversation rather than just, fat equals bad or unhealthy or what have you, and goes a lot more into the ways that we as a society dehumanize people who are larger, not only in terms of some of the language we use, but also just in terms of some of the procedures that are around. The fact that somebody might go to a doctor and have the doctor only focus on their weight when actually they're complaining about something else that's gone wrong with them in their body. They're saying, well, actually, this thing is unusual for me, but the doctor's like, probably weight related. And so I think this book is a really even-handed approach of that. There's a real sense of anger, there's a real sense of frustration that is through this book, but also I think Aubrey Gordon is so good at writing, sort of conveying research and difficult concepts in a really accessible and understandable way, I think. And again, was a book that I only really meant to read a little bit of while I was just on a bus, just because I was like, I need some nonfiction. And then I ended up just really sort of tearing through this and really loving it. A really powerful and interesting book. And I think she's got a book that's just come out as well, which I'm really keen to read. Next up, I read Constructing a Nervous System by Margo Jefferson. And this is a non-fiction book that is really quite difficult to pin down in terms of genre, I think, really. So at points, this feels a little bit like memoir. At times, this feels a little bit like a set of essays. At times, it feels a little bit more like a polemic. It's just and other times, sort of like a biography. It's really interesting. So essentially, the core idea is Margo Jefferson exploring the world that she inhabits as a black woman in the US through other predominantly black women who were famous in various sort of times. So she looks at, for example, Etta James is one person who she sort of focuses in on, talks a little bit about how Etta James had this really tricky childhood that isn't often spoken about a great deal, or at least Margo Jefferson didn't really feel like she understood when she first encountered her music. And then she also goes in to talk about various other women through history in this really fascinating way. And the book kind of at its outset talks about how this idea of constructing a nervous system is also partly Margo Jefferson trying to find her way of dealing with the world and understanding the world. And so it's really bizarre almost at times, because this book feels like it's sort of reaching for this sort of philosophy or for a kind of a wider understanding of the world, but it does so in such a fascinating way for me that it just sort of defies genre really interestingly, because we get these little portraits into these people's lives, but then it kind of comes back to Margo Jefferson and her own understanding of it, and there's a sort of a dreamlike quality to this book. I just found it really interesting. At times I didn't really know what I was reading, but I really loved that about it. I think that is actually its strength, that this isn't a straightforward book, and it explores some really fascinating kind of ideas and lives within its pages. Next up, I read a couple of books for the Republic of Consciousness Prize, some slightly more successfully than others. So the Republic of Consciousness Prize is a prize for small and indie presses to give them a bit of extra love. And what I really appreciate about the prize is, even if I don't like a book, I really appreciate the way that they've chosen weird and wonderful books that indie presses often really lead the way with, because indie presses can almost take a bit more of a gamble on a book not having to be incredibly commercial or incredibly sellable. And so they do these kind of weird and wonderful things. The first one I did struggle with a little bit, and that book is called New Mind-Mapping Forms by Ďurovec. And it's a weird and wonderful book in many ways. The main bit being that it's written in felt tip pen, and it is I'll insert image here of what a typical page looks like, where it's almost this kind of attack of text, because it's all in capitals, all in felt tip pen. There are different shapes. Sometimes things are upside down or sideways. It has a kind of key at the beginning of, I think, 6 or 7 different colours for different types of things within the book. So black is sort of things that she experiences herself. Red is, I want to say, dreams, or maybe that's a different colour. I can't remember them all exactly now, but they all interweave. And there's a lot about this book that I really enjoyed in terms of the way it approaches some really difficult topics around fascism and kind of growing dissatisfaction in the workplace, as in, this sort of hyper-capitalist work model where people are sort of, doing mindless jobs or meaningless jobs or what have you. It leans a lot into that and does some really interesting things, and then talks about fascism and talks about sort of global uncertainty and so many other things, which are all topics I really think are great for exploring in books. My main concern really was that I found this book really difficult to read at times, partly because of almost entirely because of the way it's structured. And in fairness to the author, I think when she originally wrote this, she didn't intend for this to be the way it was published or what have you. It was sort of, that's kind of how she'd written this as a sort of master's thesis / personal diary thing. And it is really interesting in its own way. I think I just really struggled with being able to access it because at times I couldn't really understand what was going on the page. I know that there are probably people who would enjoy this a lot more than me. I really struggled because I just couldn't. I found that I was reorienting my page or trying to read something more than I was actually taking in what was being said. So actually, I think if this had been in the structure of something like the Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies, where it's a sort of fairly standard text form, but with little bits sort of breaking out or in different fonts or on like little post-its on the page or what have you, I think I could have enjoyed this a little bit more. But otherwise, super interesting and not really like anything else I think I'm going to read this year. That's certain. Next up, also on the Republic of Consciousness long list, I read An Unusual Grief by Yewande Omotoso. And this is from a small Nigerian press that publishes a lot of stories, well, Nigerian and London-based press, that publishes a lot of stories around Nigeria by Nigerian authors. And this is a story of a woman who, basically her daughter is killed and she tries to find out what's gone on in her life, partly by assuming her identity. So she is walking around pretending to be Yinka. In the meantime, she finds out, for example, a lot about about her daughter's life that she hadn't previously known, including she starts going on dates pretending to be Yinka and finds out that her daughter was involved in, for example, like the kink scene, or it was involved in various other things. And so she finds out all of these details, all of which obviously lead to quite a complicated relationship for this mother to understand quite what has gone on in her daughter's life. It's I found it really engaging and a very easy read. It's very sort of compulsive and sort of plot driven and sort of really drives itself forward. So I found actually that although it's about 250 pages, I read it pretty much in one sitting and just really enjoyed it. I think it's a really interesting book and was a nice, at least slightly more accessible book on the Republic of Consciousness long list for me, at least in terms of just reading words on a page. Following up with some more weird and wonderful books, I read Grimmish by Michael Winkler, sorry, which I don't think is actually out in the UK yet. I thought it was, and I managed to get it from my library somehow. But I'm now finding out that it's actually due to come out in the UK in May. So I'm not quite sure what happened here. I think this might be an Australian copy or something. Essentially, Grimmish is a story about a boxer, and that is a very simple way of saying the story because this book is bonkers in what I think is a great way. So the whole idea of this is that this is a bit of a story of a boxer told ostensibly by his uncle. But there's a very weird metafiction, autofiction thing going on in here where the author is kind of the uncle, but also maybe not, but is sort of Michael Winkler, but sort of isn't. And it's this sort of really raucous story about boxing, but it's also full of literary references all the way through. In some of the opening pages of this book, it's a very self-aware book in a very strange way. So the book says at the beginning, well, you'll probably notice, lots of people will criticize this book for not having any women characters in it. So we've introduced a woman character. You'll meet her later. And then when we do meet the woman, this one woman in the book says, right, so I did tell you there'd be a woman character. Here she is. She's the woman character, and then moves on. And there's a real knowingness about this book that it does that all the way through of, it'll be talking about something fairly mundane, and then it'll sort of just have a footnote and we'll say Hilary Mantel, blah, 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 and have a reference to an essay or a book she's written. And so it's this really bizarre book, and I don't really know where to place it or how to talk about it in some ways, because it is just such a joke on the reader. Also, there's a talking goat, and I really probably should have led with that. And it's introduced in this sort of the most sort of like, you know, blasé way of like, oh yeah, and there's this goat and he talks. But at one point, the narrator and the goat are sort of having a disagreement and a bit of an argument. So you're kind of reading the author disagreeing with himself through a goat. So, you know, he'll say, well, we didn't really need to give you that detail, did we? But, you know, maybe we should. Oh, no, but, you know, but no, actually, maybe we should. And it's weird. It is bizarre. And I kind of loved it because it's so daring. It's so audacious with how it approaches the idea of fiction. Yeah, I think this is going to be one to watch when it comes out in the UK in May. I think it's been out in Australia for a couple of years. But it's weird. I really want to hear other people's reactions to it because I think it's kind of great. Next up, in a weird, sort of continuing themes of weirdness, but in a very cozy way, I read Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, which bills itself as a cozy fantasy. And being someone who doesn't typically read much fantasy, this was something that was suggested for a book club I'm part of. And I was like, sure, let's try it out. I loved it. It was just, I mean, as the title and the fact that it calls itself cozy kind of attests to, this book is just very chilled. There are such low stakes. Essentially, it's about an orc who sets up a coffee shop in this sort of medieval world. She's really excited about running her coffee shop. She meets a succubus. They sort of become business partners / lovers. In the meantime, there is a bard who keeps turning up to the cafe and sort of performing. There's this whole thing about energy stones and sort of energy lines in the cafe. There's a cat that is sort of like a ghost apparition devil thing. There's a rat or ratkin who does all the cooking and is basically constantly high on coffee. It is brilliant. Again, a book that I pretty much read in like 2 sittings. It's just delightful. I did say sort of at the beginning of the year that I wanted to read a few more books that were just for pleasure. This being a very good example of that. It was just so cozy, so lovely. And there's even a recipe at the back of this for making a sort of baked good that turns up in the book for some thimblets, which I might actually try and make. Yeah, I had the book club talking about this last night. And we were all just like, it was actually a very short book club because all of us were like, this was great, we loved it. There's very little to say apart from this was amazing. So yeah, highly recommend it if you're looking for something very cozy. And on a similar note, I, again, as I mentioned, don't typically read fantasy, but somebody, an author a couple of months ago sent me over their book, which is also a fantasy book, less cozy in the direct sense, but was still interesting, called A Wizard's Dream by Hrvoje Butković. I'm probably getting that name entirely wrong. And this was just a really, just a nice way to also follow up having read some more fantasy with something else a bit fantasy. Again, I'm really new to the genre, so I don't know where it sits in terms of that, but you know, still full of all the kind of typical things that you might expect in fantasy in terms of some wizards and goblins and things, you know, all the kind of magic-y bits like that. But the writing of this I found really quite pretty. It's a very lyrical book. It sort of focused a lot on you know, kind of the feeling, the kind of world building around that. It's less focused on sort of let's get through this plot. It's lots of sort of short chapters, but exploring some really quite pretty ideas. And I found Asya, the main character, quite interesting just for how she kind of interacts with the world in sort of wizardy way. So yeah, do check it out if that sounds like it'd be of interest to you. Again, I'm very new to fantasy, but it was just a nice, easy read for me nonetheless. And then we come to 2 books that were less easy reads, but still really interesting in their own rights. The first being Golem Girl by Riva Lehrer. And this won the Barbellion Prize in its first year. So we're now on the 3rd year of the Barbellion Prize. And it talks about Riva, who is a woman who from a young age sort of had spina bifida and sort of she, as a result, has this really complicated relationship with her body, with her sexuality, with how she sort of interacts with the world, but is also an artist. And so a lot of this book, I'll sort of flick through and you'll probably, I say that, I flicked through all the pages that didn't have any pictures. I will find one. But she has, for example, lots of her own paintings and artwork in this book. And she, for example, let me find one that I can actually show on YouTube without getting demonetized. There we go. So, for example, we have some of her paintings that come into the book. And a large part of what she focuses on at one point is her portraits of people who she meets, disabled people typically, who she kind of wants to show a different side of them. And she does this whole collection of paintings all about people who live in disabled bodies, essentially, and what that means for them and their understanding of the world, and various things. And through doing so, she aims to sort of give a bit of extra power back to people. So these are not the images that you typically see, at least sort of in the past, have seen a lot of it for disabled people, of, you know, here is a picture of them, and sort of it's an object of pity almost. These are really empowering pictures that show character traits about them. Their disability is sort of part of the picture, but the main focus is them and their character and something about them. And it's just really interesting. And then right at the back, she has let me find it. She has all of the people whose art she's included in the book, and has sort of mini interviews with them, or mini bios on them, talking about how they came to know her. It also at one point includes Alison Bechdel, which was a lovely surprise. Alison Bechdel being the author of Fun Home and just a few other amazing books. So yeah, really nice to see that little crossover. But a really beautiful book. It's sort of, you know, we get a lot about her life, her Jewishness, and her relationship to her Jewish identity. But a lot about her as this really caring friend and teacher and what have you. And yeah, a really gorgeous book. And last but not least, Salman Rushdie's Victory City, which I really greatly enjoyed. I've got a separate review on this coming out that's mostly spoiler free, but this is a story of essentially the founding story of India, or at least of a city in India, told through a different lens. So Rushdie himself has always been quite obsessed, I think, in his writing with fairy tales and myths, and where there's that sort of blurred line between a story that is realistic and could possibly have happened, and a sort of magical element to it. So, for example, in Midnight's Children, we get the story of India and partition told through these sort of magic children. But we also, in Victory City, get the story of the founding of a city and how that city was protected for several hundred years, or came to be over several hundred years, but also told through this woman at the heart of it, whose name Pampa Campana, who is magic, and so she lives for 240 odd years, and in doing so, she sort of sees the long history of this town coming to be, against sort of infighting between family members who all want a piece of the pie, and colonial powers and various other things. So she's sort of our history book, essentially, watching 200 years pass. So really interesting. I think I enjoyed this a lot more than I'm always a little bit worried with Rushdie, because I've mostly enjoyed his books, but sometimes I've found it a little bit hard to get involved in them. And this is one that I really did enjoy. And yeah, we shall see, probably, I'd imagine, a decent contender to be on the long list for the Booker later this year, and probably other prizes. But interesting in its own right, and his first book since he was attacked sort of recently. So there's probably a little bit more of a spotlight on this book than there would otherwise be. But Salman Rushdie releasing a new book is always a fairly big occasion in the literary world, anyhow. But anyway, yes, those are all of the many books I've read this week. That is a lot of books. I realise that's not a typical amount. It is largely because I'm putting off doing an essay. So the first couple of days of being off this week, where I was convinced I was going to dedicate myself to this essay, did not happen. Instead, I just read several books and sat around cafes and sat on my bed with my cat, which has been great. So yeah, but it's been lovely regardless, and I'm really keen to read a few more books from some of these authors, and or from some of these prizes. The next few weeks will probably be a little bit dominated by prizes, and then we hit the International Booker Prize, so probably more. But I hope you've had a good week, both in terms of reading and generally. I've been Bob the Booker. Speak to you all soon, and take care. Bye bye.